I was halfway across the world, boots on the ground in Iraq, doing what I had sworn an oath to do: serve and protect my country. I wasn't thinking about HOA fees. I wasn't thinking about my front door, my mailbox, or whether someone was tampering with the lock on my home. I was thinking about staying alive, keeping my unit safe, and making it home to the place I loved, the house I bought with years of savings and pride. That house was more than a structure. It was mine. It was my peace after chaos. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that while I was dodging bullets and sandstorms, a different kind of enemy was closing in back home. When I finally returned, worn and hopeful, dreaming of my bed and the smell of my old couch and the silence of my own living room, I found something else entirely. My key didn't work. The lock was changed. For a moment, I thought maybe I had the wrong house. Jet lag, trauma, exhaustion. But no. My name was still on the mailbox. My flag still hung from the front porch. And yet, I stood outside, like a stranger to my own life. It turned out the Homeowners Association had changed the locks, over an $800 dispute. Fees I never knew existed. Fines that grew while I was in a desert war zone. And worse, much worse, they had already sold my home. They auctioned it off while I was in uniform serving this country. No warning, no hearing, no chance to fix it. They sold everything I had worked for, behind my back. And this is how I found out. Before everything changed, my life was pretty ordinary. I had just turned the corner on my 30s, settled into a rhythm that felt solid. I'd bought the house a few years earlier, after scraping together savings from deployments and side jobs. It wasn't a mansion, but to me, it was everything. A 3-bedroom home with a small yard, an old oak out front, and a porch just big enough to sit and watch the world go by. That house wasn't just property. It was my symbol of progress, something tangible I had earned. Every dent in the wall, every coat of paint, every scratch on the floor, it all told the story of a man building a future. The neighborhood was quiet. Families, retirees, folks who kept their lawns tidy and waved when you drove by. The HOA existed, sure, but I'd never had any real issues. They sent occasional letters about mowing grass or trimming trees, the usual stuff. I complied, paid my dues on time, and went about my life. There were no heated exchanges or fines, no warnings that something could spiral out of control. In my mind, everything was in order. I was respectful, responsible, and up to date. Before I left for Iraq, I made sure everything was set. Mortgage payments were on auto-pay, utilities suspended where needed, neighbors alerted. I even left a key with someone I trusted. I walked through every room the day before I flew out, touching the walls, making sure the doors were locked, the windows closed. It was hard leaving, but I took comfort in the idea that home would be waiting when I returned, untouched, familiar, safe. That house had seen family barbecues, holiday dinners, quiet evenings with a book in hand, and football games on Sunday afternoons. It had heard laughter echo down the hallway, felt the warmth of my dog curled up by the fireplace. It was more than shelter. It was a life I had built with grit, sweat, and discipline. I went to Iraq believing that home was the one constant, the one thing that couldn't be taken away. I had no idea just how wrong I was. Deployment in Iraq was a world apart from anything back home. The heat was relentless, the kind that soaked into your bones and stayed there. The air smelled of dust and diesel, and the soundscape was a mix of distant gunfire, roaring engines, and static-filled radio calls. Every day blurred into the next. Briefings at dawn, patrols in the afternoon, and sleepless nights under a sky full of stars that somehow felt colder than home. You learned to live minute by minute, eyes sharp, heart steady. One wrong move, one missed detail, and everything could change in a flash. That was the rhythm of life out there, tense, gritty, and unforgiving. But in the middle of all that chaos, thoughts of home were a kind of lifeline. I held onto them like armor. I imagined walking through my front door, tossing my keys on the kitchen counter, dropping my gear by the couch, and collapsing into the familiar silence. When things got rough, and they often did, I would close my eyes and think about mowing the lawn, smelling fresh-cut grass, or having a cold drink on the back porch. I clung to that image of normalcy. It helped me survive the dust storms, the fear, the loss. It reminded me of who I was beyond the uniform. Communication was scarce. Internet access came in bursts. Letters took weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. Calls were precious and rare. I had no idea what was happening with my house. I assumed no news meant no problems. I had done everything by the book before leaving. Set up automatic payments, notified the right people, covered every base I could think of. It never crossed my mind that someone might be watching the clock, waiting for an opportunity to act while I was unreachable. I was out there doing my duty, trusting that the systems back home would respect that my absence wasn't an invitation for betrayal, that being a deployed service member still counted for something. What I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly have foreseen, was that while I was risking everything for my country, the very ground I called home was already slipping away, quietly, legally, and without a shred of decency. It all started with what they claimed was an unpaid balance of $800. That number would come to define everything that followed. I didn't even know it existed. There were no calls, no emails, no alerts that reached me while I was deployed. Just a growing storm back home that I couldn't see or respond to. From what I pieced together later, it began as something small, a missed payment, maybe an overdue notice I never saw because I was overseas and had changed my mailing address through the military. The HOA kept sending letters to an empty mailbox, fully aware that I wasn't there, fully aware that I was serving in a war zone. But instead of contacting me through any of the channels I had provided, they just kept sending paper into silence and letting the fines snowball. What started as a minor fee quickly turned into a bloated sum thanks to penalties, interest, and administrative charges. Every month, it grew like a parasite feeding on the very stability I had worked so hard to build. At no point did anyone pause and ask, "Where is this man? Why isn't he responding? Could he be deployed?" It wouldn't have taken much effort. I had listed my status as active duty. I had filled out the forms, submitted the paperwork. They knew, or they should have. But ignorance, real or feigned, served them better. It gave them an excuse to escalate things without resistance. By the time I returned, the $800 had already done its damage. That amount became a wall between me and my own home. I asked for details. How did it get that high? Why wasn't I notified? The answers were robotic, cold, buried in legalese. They hid behind policy and procedures, as if protocol was a shield for their complete lack of humanity. I wasn't just any homeowner. I was an American soldier serving in active combat. I wasn't on a cruise. I wasn't on vacation. I was in Iraq, surviving one day at a time while my home was being stripped away by people who couldn't be bothered to make a phone call. And here's the worst part. I would have paid it. In full. Immediately. If someone had just said, "Hey, you owe $800 and things are getting serious," I would have moved mountains to resolve it. Instead, they let the clock run out. They let the process unfold like I didn't exist. To them, I was just another name on a spreadsheet, another account number in default. They didn't see the man behind the debt. They didn't care that I was thousands of miles away, carrying a rifle instead of a checkbook. They had the power, and they used it, not with compassion, but with calculation. And by the time I knew what was happening, it was already too late. When my deployment ended, all I wanted was to go home. I had counted the days, imagined the feeling of stepping back into my house, of breathing in that familiar air that smelled like safety. My duffel bag was heavy, but my heart was light. I had made it through another tour. I was proud, exhausted, and ready to rest. The cab dropped me off out front, and I stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. The yard was a little overgrown, the shutters slightly weathered, but it was mine. Or so I thought. I reached for my keys, slid one into the lock, and turned. Nothing. I tried again. Nothing. My hand froze. Maybe I was too tired. Maybe the key was warped. I jiggled it, checked the number. This was the right house. I knocked, hoping maybe the neighbor with my spare key had stopped in and locked it differently. No answer. I walked around, looked in through the windows. My furniture wasn't there. My curtains were gone. That sick feeling started to crawl up my spine, the kind that tells you something is deeply, irreversibly wrong. I called the HOA. It took a while to get someone on the line. When I finally did, the conversation felt like a punch to the gut. "That property has been transferred," the woman said, like she was reading from a manual. I asked what she meant. She said the home had been auctioned, sold, gone. I didn't understand. I thought she had the wrong file. I was still on the deed. I had never signed anything, never been served, never even received a warning. But they were calm, almost smug. "The lock was changed according to procedure," she said, as if that made it okay. I sat on the front step with my bag beside me, staring at a house I no longer owned. Strangers lived inside, or maybe it was still empty, I didn't know. I just knew I wasn't allowed in. My clothes, my photos, the medals on my shelf, gone. I had come back from war only to lose everything I thought was waiting for me. Not from an enemy in uniform, but from a boardroom full of neighbors who had the power to destroy a life with a vote. I walked away from that house in disbelief, every step heavier than the last. I wasn't just locked out of my home. I had been erased from it. No phone call, no email, just silence, and then a lock I could no longer open. The battlefield didn't take my home. Bureaucracy did. And in that moment, I realized that the fight wasn't over. Not for my country, but for justice. For what was mine. For the home that was stolen while I was serving to protect the very system that allowed it to happen. The days that followed felt like living in someone else's nightmare. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't even think straight. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the front door of my house, the lock that wouldn't turn, the curtains missing from the windows. I kept replaying the moment the HOA told me it was gone, like if I dissected their words enough times, I'd find a loophole, a mistake, some thread I could pull to unravel the whole thing. But reality didn't budge. I started digging, desperate to understand how something like this could even happen. I went to the county office, requested every document tied to my name. That's when the papers started coming in. Pages filled with legal language, timelines, signatures I never gave. My name was on the original deed, but the new one had someone else's. The house had been sold at auction, quietly, efficiently, as if it were just another line item on a list. They called it a lien foreclosure. They called it lawful. They called it final. But I called it theft. I stared at the sale notice in disbelief. The property had been listed and sold for a fraction of its value, snatched up by someone who likely had no idea the story behind the address. There was no court appearance, no judge, no warning. Just a process that moved like a machine, grinding forward without ever asking whether it was crushing a life in the gears. I saw the dates on the paperwork and realized they did all this while I was still in Iraq, carrying out missions, sleeping in tents, watching my brothers fall beside me. All that time I was trusting that back home, the country I was serving wouldn't betray me. But while I was fighting for freedom, I lost mine to silence and fine print. I tried contacting the person who now held the deed, hoping maybe they'd understand. Maybe there was still a way to undo this, but they had already started remodeling. To them, I was just a ghost, someone who used to own the place. It didn't matter that it was my couch that had once sat in that living room, or my dog who had left claw marks by the back door. It didn't matter that I had fought halfway across the world, thinking I'd be coming home to that exact spot. All that mattered to the system was that $800 had gone unpaid. What stunned me most wasn't just the loss. It was how easy it had been for them. No call, no knock, no effort to see me as a person. Just a file, a fee, and a procedure. They didn't just take my house. They took the time, effort, and sacrifice that home represented. And worst of all, they did it while I was serving them. Serving all of them. That betrayal, that silence, it hurt more than any wound I brought back from war. When the shock began to fade, it was replaced by something else. Anger. Not the kind that burns fast and fizzles out, but the slow, simmering kind that sits in your chest and refuses to leave. I couldn't let this happen without a fight. I didn't survive Iraq just to be defeated by a homeowners association. So I found an attorney, one who had experience with HOA disputes, and I laid everything out. The deployment orders, the payment records, the silence, the lockout. I remember the look on his face as he read through the documents, part disbelief, part disgust. He said it was one of the most outrageous abuses of power he'd seen. We filed suit. It wasn't just about getting the house back anymore. It was about making sure this didn't happen to someone else. Word started spreading. Local news stations picked up the story, then a national outlet. Headlines read, "Veteran returns from war to find his home sold over HOA fees." It hit a nerve with people. Strangers began reaching out. Veterans, homeowners, families. People who had faced similar threats from their own HOAs, or who simply couldn't believe that something like this was even legal. The support poured in, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely alone. The HOA, of course, dug in their heels. They sent lawyers, released statements full of jargon and policy. They insisted everything had been done by the book, that I had been notified, that the sale was proper. They clung to their procedures like a shield, never once acknowledging the bigger picture, that a deployed soldier had lost his home because of their rigid, soulless process. They didn't apologize. They didn't even flinch. But I wasn't going to back down. I stood in front of cameras and told my story. I testified in court. I spoke at veterans groups, town halls, even to lawmakers. I laid bare what had been done and demanded that someone listen. And people did. Public pressure began to build. Petitions were started. Advocacy groups got involved. The case wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a symbol of something much larger, a broken system that could punish someone for serving their country. The legal battle dragged on for months. Motions, hearings, deadlines. There were nights I wanted to give up, to let it go and try to rebuild somewhere else. But then I'd remember standing in front of my door, duffel bag in hand, and the sound of the key not turning. That memory kept me going. Because this wasn't just about a house. It was about justice, about dignity, about making sure the people who wore the uniform were never again blindsided by the very communities they fought to protect. And in that fight, I realized something. My voice had power. My story had weight. And even if I never stepped foot in that house again, I could still make sure that what happened to me wouldn't be allowed to happen in silence ever again. What happened to me isn't just my story. It's a warning. A wake-up call for every man and woman in uniform who leaves home believing their sacrifice is respected, their rights protected. Because the truth is, there are cracks in the very system we defend, and those cracks can swallow you whole if you're not looking. I was deployed overseas, serving this country in a combat zone, trusting that the law would offer some grace, some shield, for those who are doing their duty. But the law didn't protect me. It failed me. It allowed a process to unfold that didn't require a judge, didn't require a phone call, didn't even require common sense. Just a late fee and a stamp. That's all it took to lose everything. And I'm not the only one. Since sharing my story, I've heard from dozens of other veterans, people who came home to threats of foreclosure, outrageous fines, or liens placed on their homes while they were serving. It's not just unfair, it's dangerous. We send people off to war with one hand and let bureaucracy dismantle their lives with the other. There should be laws, real, enforceable protections that prevent this. Because serving overseas shouldn't mean forfeiting the right to due process at home. Veterans deserve more than parades and medals. We deserve peace of mind, the kind that lets us do our job without fear that our lives are being torn apart while we're away. I lost my home, but I refuse to lose my voice. If my story can spark change, can lead to new laws, more oversight, better safeguards, then maybe it won't all be for nothing. Maybe the next soldier will come home to an open door, not a lock and a letter that says, "You've been replaced." I came home expecting peace, expecting the quiet comfort of my own bed, my own kitchen, the walls that held my life together. Instead, I found a lock that wouldn't turn, and a voice on the phone telling me I didn't belong there anymore. They didn't see the years I spent building that home, or the sleepless nights I spent defending a country that allowed it to be taken from me. They saw a number on a spreadsheet, a late fee, a loophole they could exploit. But what they took wasn't just property, it was trust. Trust in a system that should have protected me, not erased me. This wasn't an accident. This was a consequence of silence, of unchecked power, of rules that forget the human beings they affect. I fought for freedom, and I returned to find that mine had been signed away without my knowledge. I don't want pity. I want justice. Not just for me, but for every veteran who puts on that uniform and leaves everything behind. We deserve laws that protect us when we can't protect ourselves. We deserve communities that understand sacrifice. And we deserve a voice in what happens to the homes we've fought to come back to. So I'm asking you, don't let this story end here. Share it. Talk about it. Call your representatives and demand that they do better. Make sure the people making these decisions know we're watching. Let this be more than just one man's loss. Let it be a turning point. Because no soldier should ever come home to find that the battle followed them back. No one who serves should return to find the front door locked and their life sold to the highest bidder. We can't fix the past, but we can fight for the future.